I stood there at the cemetery, my husband's folded flag digging into my chest like it was holding me together. My son's words, cold, clipped, still rang in my ears. Don't expect anything from me. Get a job. Gravel crunched under his expensive shoes as he walked away, leaving me with nothing but the scent of turned earth and the hollow silence of goodbye. But what he didn't know, what he never saw coming, was that I'd turn that silence into strategy and make sure he got exactly what he told me to expect. Nothing. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The wind at the cemetery was sharp, carrying with it the faint bite of pine needles and the metallic tang of freshly turned earth. Carolyn Hayes stood beside the casket, her black coat tugging against her frame as though it too was trying to hold her upright. The folded flag in her arms was heavy, not just in weight but in meaning. The last tangible symbol of a life she had built with her husband, now gone. Mourners drifted away slowly, their murmurs dissolving into the sound of gravel crunching under shoes. Some clasped her hands with quiet sympathy. Others simply pressed her arm before walking back to their cars. She thanked them with a nod, her voice too raw for words. Emma lingered near her grandmother, standing stiff and pale in her dark dress. The 19-year-old's eyes were glassy, red from crying, but her hand brushed lightly against Carolyn's elbow, grounding her. Carolyn gave her a faint squeeze in return. Emma was the only part of this fractured family that still felt whole. Mark approached last. His steps were slow, deliberate, but not with grief. His tailored suit looked sharper than the occasion called for, and his wife Dana hovered just behind him, her manicured nails clutching the strap of her handbag. Caroline braced herself. Her son had been distant during the service, his expression unreadable, his condolences perfunctory. He waited until the last of the family had climbed into their cars before speaking. His words came low, clipped, cutting straight through the quiet. "Mom, I'll make this simple. Don't expect anything from me. Get a job," Caroline blinked, her breath catching. She thought she'd misheard, but his cold stare told her otherwise. "Mark," she whispered, her voice brittle, "your father has only just been laid to rest." "That's exactly why I'm saying it now," he replied, his jaw tight. "He isn't here to carry you anymore. I've got my own life, my own bills. You'll need to figure yours out." Dana gave a small shrug, as though to confirm the cruelty. "It's better she hears it now than later," she said lightly, her tone polished but empty. Caroline felt her knees weaken. She gripped the folded flag tighter, the fabric biting into her palms. The man standing in front of her, her own son, spoke not as family but as a stranger, one who had already cut ties. Behind a cluster of gravestones, Emma had paused on her way back. She had heard every word, her face twisted, horror flashing across it, quickly hardening into disgust. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Dad, how could you say that? To Grandma? Today of all days?" Mark's eyes flicked to his daughter, irritation sparking. "Stay out of it, Emma. You don't understand how the world works." "I understand enough," Emma snapped, her voice breaking. "I understand you just buried your father and decided to bury your mother right along with him." Carolyn's breath shuddered out of her. She wanted to defend herself, to cry, to collapse. But instead she straightened her spine, gripping the flag tighter until her knuckles whitened. She didn't let the tears come, not here, not in front of them. Mark adjusted his tie, his expression flat. "I've said what needed saying." He turned to Dana, and the two of them walked briskly toward the row of waiting cars, their silhouettes stiff against the setting sun. Emma rushed to her grandmother's side, her voice urgent. "Don't listen to him. He's wrong. He's cruel." Caroline finally allowed her shoulders to sag, but only for a moment. She looked down at the folded flag in her arms, her husband's flag, and pressed it close against her chest. The grief that had hollowed her out moments ago now mixed with something else. Resolve. Her son had thought he ended the conversation at the grave. He didn't realize he had started a new one. Caroline gripped the flag tighter, her mind already moving past sorrow and into strategy. Night fell heavy over Denver, the kind of darkness that pressed against the windows and reminded Caroline just how empty the house had become. The silence was suffocating, no TV murmuring in the background, no rustle of her husband's paper, just the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the living room, each chime reminding her of the future she had to face alone. Caroline sat at her desk, the old oak one her husband had insisted on keeping even after retirement. The lamp's yellow glow threw shadows across the stacks of paperwork that had been waiting for her since the funeral. She ran her fingers across the wood's grooves, worn smooth from decades of balancing checkbooks and writing birthday cards. Finally, she pulled out the binder her husband had left her. Thick, leather-bound, and meticulously labeled. He had been a credit union officer until the day he retired. His life's work was order, and that order was now her compass. The faint smell of paper and ink rose as she flipped open the first section. Insurance, policies, pensions. Every page was organized with precision, and then she reached the tab that made her stomach twist. Estate. Her finger traced the bolded name listed as primary heir, Mark Hayes. The words blurred for a moment as her eyes filled. She pressed the back of her hand against them, steadying herself. Her husband had chosen their son out of expectation, tradition, never imagining that Mark would stand over his mother's grief and demand she fend for herself. A quiet knock broke her trance. Emma peeked in, her face pale in the lamplight. She carried 2 mugs of tea, the steam curling in the air. Setting one beside her grandmother, she sank into the chair across from her. "What are you looking at?" Emma asked softly. Caroline turned the binder toward her. "Your grandfather's estate plan. He made sure everything was in order, except..." Her voice trailed as she tapped her son's name with the pen. "Except..." This Emma leaned forward, scanning the page. When she saw her father's name listed in black and white, her expression hardened. "Grandma, don't let him win." Not after what he said at the cemetery, Caroline inhaled slowly, the words sinking into her bones. She picked up her red pen, the one she had always used for corrections at the credit union. With deliberate pressure, she circled Mark's name again and again until the paper dented under the ink. "He won't," she said. Her voice was low, steady, and colder than Emma had ever heard it. The room seemed to shift then, as though the very walls understood a decision had been made. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, but inside, Caroline felt something stir. The faintest ember of control reigniting. Emma reached across the desk, her hand brushing Caroline's. "So what happens now?" Caroline closed the binder with a snap, the sound echoing through the quiet house. She rose, moving to the phone on the corner of her desk. Her hands no longer trembled. "What happens now," she said, dialing with precision, "is that we make sure Mark gets exactly what he told me to expect. Nothing." The phone rang twice before a calm, steady voice answered. "Victor Lang, Estate Law." Caroline's grip tightened on the receiver. "Mr. Lang, this is Caroline Hayes. I need an appointment." "Urgent." Her gaze drifted back to the binder on the desk. Mark's name still circled in angry red. She pressed the phone closer to her ear, her voice steel now. "It's time to rewrite my legacy." The glass tower downtown gleamed in the afternoon sun, its mirrored surface reflecting the city traffic below. Caroline stood at the entrance, clutching her purse close, the weight of the binder inside like a silent ally. Her husband had always handled the meetings with bankers and attorneys, but today she walked in alone, not timidly, but with a quiet, sharpened purpose. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and fresh coffee, the air conditioning carrying a cool bite against her cheeks. She checked in at the front desk, then took the elevator up to the 12th floor. As the doors slid shut, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. Her posture straight, her eyes clear, her grief tucked behind something stronger. Victor Lang's office overlooked the city, glass windows stretching wide to the Rockies in the distance. He rose from behind his desk as she entered, extending a hand. His grip was steady, his presence calm but assured, a man who didn't waste words. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, guiding her to a chair. "I'm sorry for your loss. What brings you here today?" Caroline placed the binder on the desk between them and opened it with precision. The smell of paper and ink rose again, comforting in its order. She slid the estate tab forward, tapping her son's name circled in red. "My husband thought he was doing the right thing," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "He named our son as heir. But the man who told me at his father's grave to get a job will not receive a dime of what we built together." Victor's expression didn't flicker with surprise. Instead, his lips pressed into a thin line of recognition, as though he had seen this kind of betrayal before. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. "Tell me what happened." Caroline recounted the moment at the cemetery. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. She laid it out like a ledger entry. Her son's words, her shock, Emma's disgust. When she finished, the silence between them was taut. Finally, Victor spoke. "Then we'll make sure he gets nothing." Exactly nothing, Caroline's jaw set. "And Emma gets what matters, not just the money, the legacy," Victor nodded once, his movements deliberate. He pulled a fresh folder from his desk drawer, the faint scent of leather and ink marking a new beginning. "Here's what I propose. We'll draft a new will. Your son and his wife will be excluded entirely. We'll set up a trust for Emma, releasing assets when she turns 25, ensuring she's ready to manage it responsibly. And if you'd like, we can designate a portion toward something lasting, like a scholarship." Caroline's lips curved into the faintest smile. That's exactly what he doesn't understand. Legacy isn't about greed. It's about impact. For the next hour, they worked through numbers, accounts, and property. Victor listened intently, his pen scratching across the page with efficiency. Each account Carolyn listed, each property detail she confirmed, felt like reclaiming ground her son had tried to strip away. When the first draft lay before her, Victor tapped the paper. Every penny accounted for, except him. Caroline traced the lines with her finger, her heart steady. That's how it should be. The city stretched below them, cars moving like tiny pieces in a game her son no longer controlled. For the first time since the funeral, she felt her lungs expand with something other than grief. As she gathered her things, Victor stood. "I'll prepare the final documents for signature this week. Once they're notarized, it's locked. No matter what he tries, he can't undo it." Caroline slid the binder back into her purse, the weight suddenly lighter. "Then let's make it airtight. I want no cracks for him to slip through." She stepped out into the corridor, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step measured. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, and as she descended, her phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it out, the glow of the screen illuminating the sharp edge of a new battle. A message from Dana flashed across the display. "Don't drain our inheritance out of spite." Caroline's thumb hovered over the screen, her mouth tightening into a line. "Our inheritance?" She slipped the phone back into her bag, her mind already shifting gears. If they thought they could lay claim to what was hers, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The knock at the door was too forceful to be neighborly, too sharp to be casual. Caroline set down her teacup, her stomach tightening. She knew before she opened the door that it would be them. Mark stood on the porch, his jaw set in its familiar line of impatience. Dana hovered at his shoulder, her perfume drifting forward in an expensive wave, out of place against Carolyn's modest entryway. Without waiting for an invitation, Mark stepped inside, his shoes thudding heavily against the hardwood. Dana followed, her heels clicking like punctuation marks behind him. Carolyn closed the door with deliberate calm, her fingers brushing the latch a moment longer than necessary. "What brings you here without notice?" she asked evenly. Dana smiled, though the smile never touched her eyes. "We're worried about you. It can't be easy, managing all the bills and accounts alone. You'll need help." Mark cut in before his mother could reply, his tone brisk, businesslike. "Mom, You should just put us on your accounts. Checking, savings, all of it. That way we can step in if anything happens. Make sure nothing slips through the cracks. Caroline's eyes narrowed. The audacity was breathtaking. She crossed her arms, the silence stretching long enough to make Dana shift uncomfortably. Finally, Caroline's answer came, firm and low. No. The word landed like a stone on tile. Mark blinked, momentarily thrown. Excuse me? I said no, Caroline repeated. Her voice didn't waver. I don't need you on my accounts. I've managed money longer than you've been alive, Mark, and I'll keep managing it myself. Dana's painted lips parted in feigned disbelief. Caroline, it's not about control. It's about security. Don't you want peace of mind? Caroline's gaze flicked to the hallway, where she noticed movement. Emma, phone in hand, crouched just enough to stay out of sight. Her granddaughter's expression was taut with fury, her thumb hovering near the record button. Caroline gave the faintest nod, granting permission without words. Mark's voice rose, his frustration breaking through his practiced calm. You're being stubborn. Dad wouldn't have wanted you struggling like this. We're your family. Let us help. Caroline stepped closer, her chin lifting. Family doesn't help by taking. And I'm not struggling. I'm fine. The recording device in Emma's hand captured every syllable, every edge of steel in Caroline's tone, every snap of impatience in Mark's. Dana tried again, her tone turning sugary, false concern dripping from each word. You're grieving, Caroline. People make mistakes when they're emotional. Why not let us shoulder some of the burden? Caroline's laugh was short and humorless. The only burden I'd be giving you is temptation, and I won't do that. Not now, not ever. Mark's face hardened. His jaw clenched. He shoved his hands into his pockets. His voice clipped. Fine. If you want to make things harder on yourself, that's your choice. He turned toward the door, Dana following with a toss of her hair. As the latch clicked shut behind them, Caroline let out a slow breath. She waited until she heard their car pull away before calling into the hallway. Emma. Her granddaughter emerged, phone still in hand, eyes bright with adrenaline. I got all of it, Emma whispered. Every word. Caroline reached for the phone, listening to the playback long enough to hear Dana's patronizing tone echo through the speaker. Satisfied, she handed it back. Save a copy for yourself. And send me one. This goes in the binder. Emma smiled faintly. He's going to regret pushing you. Caroline straightened the papers on her desk later that night, sliding the recording transcript into a new tab labeled Evidence. The binder was growing thicker, not just with her husband's order, but with her own. She pressed her hand flat against it, feeling the weight of both protection and preparation. As she set the binder aside, her phone rang. The screen lit up with Victor's name. Caroline answered, her voice steady. Mrs. Hayes, Victor said, his tone calm but edged with satisfaction. The documents are ready to sign. Caroline closed her eyes for a moment, gripping the phone tighter. The trap her son thought he was setting was about to close on him instead. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and ink, the kind of scent that clung to paper after decades of contracts and signatures. Caroline sat at the polished oak table across from Victor, her binder open beside her like a trusted ally. Her pulse beat steady, not from nerves, but from certainty. Today, she wasn't the grieving widow her son imagined. Today, she was the architect of her own legacy. Victor adjusted his glasses, sliding the final draft across the table. This is it, Mrs. Hayes. Once you sign, it's binding. Do you want me to walk you through it again? Caroline scanned the clean lines of text. Her husband's estate plan had been built on tradition. This one was built on resolve. No, she said quietly. I know exactly what I'm signing. Emma sat in the corner, perched nervously on the edge of a chair. She watched her grandmother with wide eyes, biting her lip. Caroline gave her a reassuring glance before uncapping the pen Victor had set before her. She began to sign, her name flowing across page after page. With each stroke of ink, She cut ties sharper than words could. Mark and Dana excluded entirely. Their names erased from inheritance, their entitlements severed. Emma, sole beneficiary at 25, the age Caroline believed maturity would balance freedom. A portion of funds directed into a scholarship endowment at Emma's college for students in finance and counseling, the kind of people who built, not destroyed. Victor tapped the document once, firm. This ensures they can't touch a cent. Emma receives security, the scholarship builds legacy, and you keep control until your last breath. Caroline laid down the pen, her hand steady. She let the silence stretch, the gravity of the moment hanging in the air. Then she spoke, her voice calm but edged with steel. That's my legacy. Not greed, not entitlement. Something that outlives spite. Emma's eyes glistened. She whispered, "Grandma, you're incredible." Victor gathered the signed documents, sliding them into a heavy envelope. He pressed the seal across the flap with a practiced hand, the faint scent of wax mingling with the ink. "There," he said, his tone final. "It's done. They can fight, they can shout, but the law is now on your side." Caroline exhaled slowly, feeling the invisible weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since the cemetery, she felt she had not just defended herself, but struck back. Victor leaned back, studying her with quiet respect. "I've handled many cases, Mrs. Hayes. Few people are as clear as you about what matters. Most hesitate. You didn't." Caroline met his gaze, her voice calm. "My son erased me as his mother, so I erased him as my heir." The room fell into a silence that wasn't heavy, but purposeful. Outside the glass walls, Denver's skyline glittered in the afternoon sun, steady and unmoved by the storm brewing in her family. Emma slipped her hand into Caroline's, squeezing tight. "He'll never see it coming," she murmured. Caroline's smile was faint, almost sad. "That's the point." Victor tucked the sealed packet into his briefcase, clicking the lock shut. "I'll have notarized copies filed first thing tomorrow. Keep one for your records." As Caroline rose from the table, her phone buzzed in her purse. She ignored it until they were walking toward the elevator. Pulling it free, she glanced at the screen. The text preview was from her bank. Joint account ending in 2479. Closure confirmed. Caroline's lips pressed into a line. She had expected Mark would notice soon. By the time she reached home, her phone was lit with missed calls. 3 from her son, 1 from Dana. She didn't answer, but she read the final message that flashed across her screen, its tone jagged with anger. "Why did you close our account?" Caroline set the phone face down on her desk and placed her palm over the sealed envelope Victor had given her. Her son thought closing a bank account was the worst of it. He hadn't seen what was coming next, the morning after. Signing the new will, Caroline woke before sunrise. The house was quiet, the air still carrying the faint scent of lemon polish from the desk she had wiped down the night before. She sat at her kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and the binder open in front of her. Today wasn't about grief. It was about movement. She gathered her husband's meticulously kept records and headed to the credit union downtown. The building's glass doors reflected the early light, and the faint smell of disinfectant clung to the lobby. Carolyn walked with her head high, binder tucked under her arm like armor. The account manager, a young woman with clear, confident eyes, welcomed her into a small office. Carolyn explained with crisp precision, close every joint account, transfer the balances into her name only, and funnel the majority into the protected trust Victor had drafted. As the manager typed, the rhythmic click of keys felt like music to Caroline's ears. Each stroke meant another door slamming shut in Mark's face, another tie severed. By the time she left, the trust stood firm, untouchable, shielded behind legal walls Mark could not scale. The only accounts left open were those Caroline needed for daily life, and even those were tightly monitored. When she returned home, Mark was waiting in the driveway, his arms crossed, jaw rigid. Dana stood at his side, sunglasses perched on her head though the sky was still overcast. What did you do? Mark demanded the moment she stepped out of the car. His voice was clipped, the edge of panic barely hidden. Caroline shut the door with deliberate calm, locking it before slipping her keys into her purse. I handled my finances, she said evenly. You closed the accounts, Mark shot back, his face flushing. You don't trust me? Caroline met his fury with quiet steel. You told me not to expect anything from you. Neither should you expect anything from me. Donna's polished composure cracked, her lips curling into a sneer. This is petty, Caroline. Spiteful. You're just punishing us because you're bitter. Caroline's eyes sharpened. No, Dana. I'm protecting myself because you're greedy. Emma stepped out onto the porch then, her arms folded. She leaned against the railing, her voice cool. She doesn't owe you a thing. And honestly, I'm proud of her. Mark's face twisted, his words sharp as glass. You've poisoned her, Emma. You filled her head with lies. Emma's laugh was short and bitter. I didn't have to. You managed that all on your own for a moment. Silence stretched across the driveway. The distant hum of a lawnmower cut through the tension, but no one moved. Mark finally turned, muttering curses under his breath, and Dana trailed after him, heels clacking hard against the concrete. They climbed into their SUV, the slam of the doors rattling in the still morning air before the engine roared to life and carried them away. Caroline stood by the car a moment longer, breathing slowly until the anger settled back into calm resolve. Emma joined her, slipping her hand into her grandmother's. You were incredible, Emma said quietly. Dad can't stand that you're stronger than him. Caroline gave her hand a squeeze. Strength isn't about shouting louder. It's about outlasting. That evening, after Emma left for campus, Caroline returned to her desk. She slid the updated bank statements into her binder, each page a shield, each tabbed section another wall around her future. She closed it with a satisfying snap, her fingertips resting on the leather cover as though it were a lockbox, holding not just money, but dignity. The house had grown quiet when the sound of mail sliding through the slot broke the stillness. Carolyn rose and picked up the thick envelope lying on the floor. Her stomach dropped at the sender's mark. County Probate Court. She tore it open with careful hands, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the words. Petition for guardianship. Filed by Mark Hayes. Caroline sank into her chair, the paper trembling between her fingers. He wasn't done. He had just raised the stakes. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, the air thick with tension as Caroline sat at the petitioner's table. She straightened her blazer, feeling the smooth fabric under her palms. Across from her, Mark leaned forward, his expression carefully rehearsed. Dana sitting just behind him with her lips pressed into a sympathetic pout. The judge, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file. Mr. Hayes, you filed for guardianship over your mother. Please state your grounds. Mark rose with a heavy sigh, clasping his hands together like a man reluctantly burdened. His voice was pitched just right for the audience. Your Honor, my mother has been slipping. She forgets things. She makes impulsive financial decisions. I'm worried she isn't capable of handling her affairs anymore. Dana leaned in, nodding dutifully. It's true, she added softly, her tone dripping with practiced sorrow. She's not herself since my father-in-law passed. We've had to repeat things to her, and she gets confused. Carolyn's chest tightened, not from doubt, but from the audacity of their lies. She could feel Emma stiffen beside her in the gallery, fists curled tight around her phone. Victor rose with the calm of a man who had seen this play before. His voice was even, precise. Your Honor, claims without evidence are just that, claims. Allow me to show you evidence of the opposite. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew Carolyn's binder, thick and neatly tabbed. The soft thunk of it hitting the table echoed in the chamber. Victor opened it with care, sliding out page after page. Balanced check registers, itemized bills, updated tax filings, investment records color-coded with sticky. Notes. Every account reconciled, he said, handing documents to the clerk. Every bill paid on time. Every tax return filed without error. This, he tapped the binder, is competence in ink. The judge flipped through the stack, his brows lifting slightly as he skimmed the neat rows of numbers. He turned back toward Caroline. Mrs. Hayes, do you handle this yourself? Caroline stood, her voice steady. I always have, Your Honor. My late husband trusted me with our finances, and I've carried that trust forward. I know exactly where every dollar is and where it's going. I am not confused, and I am not incompetent. What I am, she let her gaze sweep across the courtroom until it landed on Mark, is a woman with a greedy son. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mark flushed, his jaw tightening, his rehearsed composure slipping. She's hiding things, he snapped. She's covering up mistakes. Victor didn't even flinch. If my client is hiding mistakes, she's hiding them with balanced ledgers, notarized statements, and tax refunds. He set another sheet in front of the judge, his tone cool. This is a frivolous petition meant to seize control of assets. Nothing more. The judge closed the file with a decisive snap. His gaze hardened on Mark. The petition for guardianship is dismissed. Mrs. Hayes is clearly competent to manage her own affairs. Mr. Hayes, do not waste this court's time again. The gavel struck once, sharp as a gunshot. Caroline exhaled, relief mingling with vindication. Victor gave her a subtle nod, while Emma nearly jumped from her seat, her face glowing with pride. Across the aisle, Mark's glare burned. He muttered something under his breath, his fists clenched, his posture rigid with defeat. Dana touched his arm, whispering, but her eyes darted nervously toward Caroline, as though realizing the tide had turned. As they left the courtroom, Emma hurried to Caroline's side, clutching her phone. Grandma, she whispered, her voice urgent but thrilled. You need to see this. She turned the screen so Caroline could read. On it were screenshots of Dana's text to a group of friends. We'll get her money sooner or later. It's just a matter of time. Caroline froze, her hand tightening on Emma's arm. The sting of betrayal cut sharper than any courtroom accusation. But this wasn't just betrayal. It was ammunition. Caroline sat at her desk the next morning, the faint hum of the printer filling the quiet room. One by one, the sheets slid out, each stamped with Dana's words in crisp black ink. We'll get her money sooner or later. It's just a matter of time. The text bubbles looked cold on the page, their casual cruelty preserved like evidence in a trial. The smell of warm toner hung in the air as Caroline gathered the stack. She smoothed the edges with steady hands before sliding them into a plastic sleeve and tucking them into her binder. The leather cover was starting to bulge now, heavy with more than numbers, heavy with truth. Emma perched on the arm of the chair, watching her grandmother's deliberate motions. They don't even realize it, do they? He said, shaking her head. They're digging their own grave. Caroline closed the binder with a snap and looked up at her granddaughter. Her eyes, usually soft with affection, gleamed with something harder. And I'm the one shoveling. Later that afternoon, Caroline walked into Victor's office with the binder tucked under her arm. The downtown tower gleamed in the sun, but her steps were sharper than before. Less hesitant widow, more strategist. Victor rose as she entered, offering a polite nod before gesturing toward the chair. You brought something, without a word. Caroline opened the binder and slid the printed screenshots across his desk. The paper whispered as it slid, the words glaring up at him like a confession. Victor read silently, his lips curving into a rare smile. This, he said, tapping the page, kills any contest attempt. If they ever argue you were coerced or manipulated, we point to this. Their greed undermines them. A judge won't need convincing after seeing these. Caroline exhaled, the tightness in her chest loosening just a fraction. So even if he files again, they'll lose faster than before, Victor finished. He slipped the copies into his folder, the faint scent of paper and ink following the motion. You've just made my job easier, Caroline nodded, her voice low but certain. Good. He thought he could bury me with his words. Now I'll bury him with his own, The two shared a quiet moment of understanding before Carolyn rose, binder in hand. She left the office not with relief but with sharpened resolve. Outside, the city moved briskly, horns blaring, people rushing past. But Caroline walked with the calm of someone who had shifted the balance in her favor. By evening, she was back home, the house bathed in the amber glow of sunset. She set the binder on her desk again, running her fingers across the smooth leather. Every tab, every sleeve, every page had become her shield. She didn't need to shout, to argue, to beg. The evidence would speak louder than any plea. Emma joined her in the kitchen a little later, pulling sodas from the fridge. "Grandma," she said softly, handing one over. "Dad's not going to stop. You know that, right?" Caroline cracked the can open, the fizz loud in the silence. She took a sip before answering. "I don't need him to stop. I just need to be ready every time he starts." The moment stretched, comfortable but taut with unspoken truths. Then came the sharp sound of knuckles rapping hard against the front door. Carolyn froze, the soda still in her hand. Emma's eyes widened, and she mouthed the word, "Dad." Carolyn set the can down, her footsteps slow but steady as she crossed the hall. She opened the door, just enough to see Mark standing on the porch, his face flushed, his fist clenched. "You'll regret cutting me out," he spat, his voice vibrating with fury. Caroline held the door frame, her knuckles white, but her gaze never wavered. He didn't know yet that she had his wife's words in ink. He didn't know she had already buried his case before it began, and she wasn't about to tell him. Not yet. The porch light flickered above Caroline's head, throwing sharp shadows across the front steps. Mark stood in the glow, his eyes hard and unrelenting. Every muscle in his jaw flexing as though he were holding back something uglier than words. "You'll regret cutting me out," he repeated, his voice low but vibrating with fury. Caroline tightened her grip on the doorframe. The wood was cool against her palm, grounding her. She had kept quiet long enough, letting him believe he still had power. Tonight, she decided, he would hear the truth. "I already erased you," she said evenly. For a moment, the words hung between them, carried by the crisp evening air. Mark blinked, thrown off balance, then scoffed with a harsh laugh. "You wouldn't. You're bluffing." Behind him, Dana stepped onto the porch, her heels clattering against the concrete. She tilted her head, lips curled into a dismissive smile. "Caroline, please. You'd never humiliate your own son like that. You're just trying to scare us." Caroline turned, walked into the living room, and returned with the heavy envelope Victor had sealed only days earlier. She broke the wax with deliberate slowness, the faint crack echoing through the hall, and pulled out the notarized copy of her new will. The paper was thick, the ink still sharp. She held it up so the porch light illuminated her name at the bottom, bold and undeniable. Not a bluff. Signed, sealed, filed. Dana's breath caught audibly, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh my God," she whispered, the first crack in her polished exterior. Mark's laughter died instantly. His face flushed crimson, his nostrils flaring as he snatched for the paper. But Carolyn pulled it back before his fingers touched it. "You wanted me to get a job," she said, her voice sharper now, the anger carefully leashed. "I gave a job to Victor Lang, and he made sure you'll never see a cent." Mark's hands balled into fists, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. "You can't do this to me." Emma appeared in the hallway, stepping past her grandmother with a calmness that seemed older than her 19 years. She glanced at the paper in Carolyn's hand and then directly at her father. She already did. The porch went quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. Caroline could hear Dana's shallow breathing, the scrape of Mark's shoe against the step, Emma's steady inhale beside her. She let the moment stretch, let the truth sink into them like a stone dropped in still water. Then she folded the will back into its envelope, slid it under her arm, and with one sharp motion slammed the front door. The sound echoed through the house, final and unyielding. Mark's muffled voice erupted outside, his curses spilling into the night. But Caroline no longer listened. She stood in the hallway, her heart pounding, Emma's hand slipping into hers. "You did it," Emma whispered. "You finally told." Him, Caroline squeezed her granddaughter's fingers gently, her breath steadying. Sometimes the truth is the sharpest weapon. By the next morning, Caroline's phone buzzed with a new storm. Emails, calls, and then the thick envelope dropped through the mail slot with a dull thud. She picked it up and saw the letterhead stamped bold at the top. County Probate Court. Inside, another filing. Mark Hayes petitioning to contest the will. Caroline closed her eyes, exhaling through her nose. He hadn't retreated. He had doubled down. The courthouse buzzed with restless energy, footsteps echoing against marble floors, voices bouncing off the high ceilings. Caroline sat at the respondents' table, her binder resting neatly in front of her. The smell of old paper and varnished benches filled the air, grounding her in a space that felt both foreign and familiar. Foreign because of the battle she hadn't chosen, familiar because of the order she carried into it. Across the aisle, Mark adjusted his tie with exaggerated calm, but his eyes betrayed the edge of desperation. Dana sat behind him, leaning forward as if feeding him confidence with her presence. They looked rehearsed, but brittle, like a performance on the verge of collapse. The judge entered, robe sweeping, gavel striking once to settle the room. His voice was crisp. "We're here on the matter of Mark Hayes contesting the will of Caroline Hayes." "Mr. Hayes, state your grounds." Mark rose, his voice pitched with forced concern. "Your Honor, my mother has been manipulated. She's grieving, vulnerable, and heavily influenced by my daughter, Emma. This so-called new will is not her true intention. It's Emma whispering in her ear." Caroline felt Emma stiffen beside her, the girl's hands curling tight in her lap. She reached out and brushed her granddaughter's knuckles, a silent reassurance. Victor stood calmly, his presence unshaken. "Your Honor, accusations of undue influence are serious, but they also require proof, and proof is exactly what Mr. Hayes lacks." Mark's jaw twitched, but he pressed on. "She doesn't even remember things correctly. She's confused, fragile." Victor cut him off smoothly. "Confused? Fragile? I submit Exhibit A." He handed a sealed folder to the clerk, who delivered it to the bench. "This is a medical evaluation from Dr. Pauline Archer, a neurologist. She examined Mrs. Hayes less than 2 weeks ago." The judge flipped through the report, his brows raising. Victor continued, his tone sharp but measured. "The evaluation concludes that Mrs. Hayes is lucid, organized, and fully competent to manage her financial and personal affairs. Her cognitive functions are well within normal range. In other words, she is anything but confused." The weight of the words settled over the courtroom. Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at Dana, who tried to mask her unease, but failed. Victor wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a small USB drive, holding it up briefly before handing it over. Exhibit B, an audio recording. Mrs. Hayes's granddaughter captured this during a conversation in which Mr. Hayes pressured his mother to sign over her accounts. It speaks for itself. The recording played through the speakers, the sound of Mark's voice filling the chamber. "Put us on your accounts, Mom. Don't be stubborn. You can't manage this alone." Dana's syrupy tone followed. "It's better she hears it now than later." The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. When the playback ended, the silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, his voice cut through it, firm and final. "This isn't undue influence, Mr. Hayes. This is elder exploitation, plain and simple. You attempted to pressure your mother into surrendering her independence. The appeal is dismissed." The gavel cracked once more, sharp as lightning. Caroline exhaled, her shoulders loosening as if a heavy chain had been lifted. She looked at Victor, who gave her the smallest nod of satisfaction. Then at Emma, whose eyes glistened with pride. Across the aisle, Mark's face burned with humiliation. His lips moved, but no sound came. his fury trapped in silence. Dana leaned close, whispering furiously, but neither could mask the defeat in their posture. As Caroline gathered her binder and rose, the tension in the room finally eased. She stepped into the hallway, the smell of coffee from a nearby vending machine mingling with the dusty scent of legal books stacked on carts. Emma clutched her arm, grinning despite everything. "You did it, Grandma. You beat him again," Caroline smiled faintly. "No, Emma." He beat himself. "I just let the truth do the work." She was halfway down the courthouse steps when her phone buzzed. Pulling it free, she saw an unfamiliar number. Curious, she answered. "Mrs. Hayes?" a bright voice asked. "This is the Denver Post. We'd like to talk to you about your case. It's making headlines." Caroline paused, the autumn wind tugging at her coat. The fight with Mark had just left the courtroom. Now it was stepping into the public eye. The newspaper arrived on Caroline's porch just after dawn, the thud of it hitting the mat startling her out of her morning quiet. She bent slowly, her fingers brushing against the cool newsprint. The bold headline stretched across the front page in black ink, each word sharper than a knife. "Widow outsmarts son's greed in court." Caroline unfolded the paper with deliberate calm, the faint smell of ink rising into the kitchen as she laid it flat on the table. Beneath the headline was a photograph, her, outside the courthouse steps, binder tucked beneath her arm, Emma beside her smiling. The image caught something unshakable in her expression. Not grief, not fragility, but resolve. Emma padded into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, hair messy from sleep. She froze when she saw the paper. "Grandma, you're on the front page." Caroline handed it to her. "So it seems." Emma's eyes darted across the lines, her mouth parting as she read aloud snippets. Caroline Hayes, 68, defended herself against her son's attempt to seize control of her estate, presenting meticulous records and winning a swift dismissal. Legal experts call it a clear case of elder exploitation stopped in its tracks. She looked up, her face flushed with pride. "They're telling your story." Caroline sipped her coffee, the bitter taste grounding her. "They're telling his too." By mid-morning, the whispers had already begun. Caroline heard them when she stepped outside to water the flowers. Mrs. Duncan from across the street waved, her voice carrying just enough. "Saw the paper this morning, Caroline. Good for you." About time someone stood up to him. 2 houses down, a pair of neighbors leaned close, murmuring. Caroline didn't need to strain to catch the words. "Imagine trying to do that to your own mother." Their voices held the weight of both disbelief and judgment, the kind that lingers in neighborhoods for years. Mark's cruelty had been private at the cemetery, then hidden behind courtroom formality. Now it was public. And nothing spread faster in a community than scandal that carried a name everyone knew. By afternoon, Dana appeared at Caroline's door, her heels clicking hard against the porch, fury etched into every line of her face. She didn't bother with greetings. She thrust the paper at Caroline, the edges crumpled from her grip. "You made us look like villains." Caroline glanced at the article, then back at Dana. Her expression didn't shift. "You didn't need my help for that." Dana's lips parted, ready to retort, but no words came. Her face flushed, a mix of rage and humiliation. She spun on her heel, storming back to her car, the slam of the door rattling down the block. Inside, Emma laughed, a sound light enough to cut through the heaviness of the day. "She can't stand the truth being printed." Caroline allowed herself the faintest smile, folding the paper neatly. The truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be seen. That evening, as the sky dimmed to deep blue, Caroline sat on her porch swing, the paper folded beside her. She listened to the distant hum of traffic, the cicadas buzzing in the yard, and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Emma joined her, leaning her head on her grandmother's shoulder. Together, they watched the quiet street, knowing the silence carried a different kind of weight now. Inside, Caroline's phone buzzed against the table. She rose to check it, the glow of the screen lighting up the darkened room. A message from an old family friend appeared first. Proud of you, Carolyn. Then another from Victor. Public opinion is powerful. This coverage will discourage further nonsense in court. But it was the next message, forwarded from an Astat Amar, acquaintance of Mark's, that made her pause. He lost a major client today. They read the article. They don't want to be associated with him anymore. Caroline set the phone down slowly, the corner of her mouth curving as the realization sank in. Her son's greed hadn't just cost him her inheritance. It was starting to cost him his future. The article faded from the headlines within a week, but its ripple remained. Caroline could feel it in the way neighbors greeted her with warmer smiles, in the way whispers about Mark carried less curiosity and more condemnation. But she hadn't gone through all of this to live on vindication alone. She wanted to leave something larger behind, something her son could never tarnish. At her kitchen table, the binder lay open again, but this time the tabs weren't just about defense. They were about creation. She sorted through scholarship paperwork, the scent of ink and fresh envelopes filling the room. Her pen moved with deliberate care, signing documents that would transform her estate into opportunity for others. Finance and counseling, the fields she and her husband had valued most. Caroline wanted to fund the futures of students who believed in responsibility, compassion, and building stability instead of tearing it apart. Emma leaned over her shoulder, her excitement bubbling. "We'll launch it through my college, Grandma. I already talked to the dean's office. They're thrilled. They'll help find the right recipients." Caroline paused, looking at her granddaughter's eager face. "It should start with you, Emma. You're the one who stood by me." Emma shook her head fiercely. "No, it needs to be bigger than me. You taught me that." The words landed like a bomb. Caroline's chest swelled with quiet pride. She reached across the table, squeezing Emma's hand before returning to the paperwork. Weeks later, the first letters arrived. Cream envelopes with college letterheads, each carrying the careful handwriting of a student whose life had just shifted. Caroline slit one open, her fingers trembling slightly. "Dear Mrs. Hayes," it began. "Thank you for believing in me when you didn't even know me. This scholarship means I can stay in school without working 2 jobs. One day, I hope to give back the way you did." Caroline read it twice before passing it to Emma, who read it aloud, her voice thick. By the time they opened the 3rd letter, both women were wiping their eyes. "These are better than any inheritance," Emma whispered. Caroline rose and crossed to the sideboard where she kept family photographs. She slipped the letters into frames and set them beside her husband's picture. His eyes smiled back at her, captured in stillness, as though approving the path she had chosen. Later that week, Victor stopped by, the autumn wind still clinging to his coat as he stepped inside. He reviewed the paperwork with meticulous care, then looked up with a rare smile. "Your legacy is untouchable now. It's in the records, in the endowment, in the law. Even if Mark tried to claw at it, he'd find nothing but walls." Caroline nodded, her gaze settling on the framed letters. "That's the point. This isn't just about keeping money from him. It's about making sure what I built goes somewhere it can grow." Emma, standing by the counter with a cup of tea, chimed in softly. "And unforgettable. People will remember you for this, Grandma, not for what he tried to do." The words wrapped around the room, as warm as the scent of cinnamon tea rising from Emma's cup. Caroline let herself lean back in her chair, her shoulders lighter than they had been in months. But peace, she knew, was always fragile. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Caroline sat on her porch swing with Emma beside her. The wood creaked softly beneath them, the air cool with the promise of winter. Across the quiet street, the maples rattled in the breeze. Caroline closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, allowing herself one moment of stillness. Then the crunch of tires on gravel snapped her eyes open. A black sedan pulled into her driveway, the engine idling low. The driver's door opened, and Mark stepped out, shoulders slumped, his suit wrinkled, his face drawn with defeat. He stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at his mother. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his posture, no sneer on his lips, only exhaustion and the faint edge of desperation. The porch light buzzed faintly as the evening deepened, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. Carolyn sat in the swing, binder resting on the table beside her, while Emma lingered in the doorway with a blanket around her shoulders. The creak of the swing slowed as the crunch of gravel grew louder. Mark stood at the bottom of the steps, shoulders hunched, his suit wrinkled and collar undone. The arrogance that once defined his every movement was gone. He looked older, heavier, as though defeat had carved itself into his features. "Mom," he began, his voice rough. "Please, I need help. I'm broke. I've lost clients. I'm drowning. You can't just leave me like this." Caroline's eyes were steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She remembered the cemetery, his cold words, "Don't expect anything from me. Get a job." She let the silence stretch until the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant bark of a dog. Finally she spoke, her voice even, cutting through the cool air. "You told me not to expect anything from you. So expect nothing from me." Mark flinched, his lips parting as though he had been slapped. His hands spread wide in frustration. "That was different. I didn't mean it like this. I was angry, grieving." Caroline's tone sharpened. "You meant every word, and I heard them clearly." Dana stepped out from the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. She crossed her arms, her expression icy. "You'll regret this, Caroline. You can't just cut your son out and build your little charity empire while he suffers. People will see you for what you are, bitter, selfish." Caroline rose slowly, the swing sighing as she left it behind. She stood tall on the porch, the light casting her shadow long across the steps. "No, Dana. I already regret something far worse. Raising entitlement. That mistake stops here." Mark's face twisted, torn between rage and desperation. His voice cracked as he tried one last plea. "I'm your son. Doesn't that count for anything?" Emma stepped forward then, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She stood beside her grandmother, her voice steady though her eyes shimmered. "You made your choice, Dad. You chose greed over family, and now you're living with it for a moment." The porch held its breath. Mark's chest heaved, his fist tightening, his mouth opening and closing without words. Then, slowly, the fight drained out of him. His shoulders slumped, his gaze fell, and he turned toward the car. Dana hissed under her breath, her heels scraping angrily against the driveway as she followed. They climbed into the sedan, the door slams echoing like punctuation marks in the night. The engine roared, headlights swept across the yard, and then the car disappeared down the street, swallowed by the dark. Caroline stood still, her breath fogging in the cool air. She looked at Emma, whose hand slipped into hers, warm and sure. Together they stepped inside. The door shut with a heavy thud, and Caroline turned the deadbolt with a decisive click. The sound echoed through the quiet house, like the final word in an argument. For years she had carried the weight of being Mark's safety net. Tonight she cut the net entirely and locked the door behind him. The garden was quiet that morning, the earth damp from a night of rain. Caroline knelt in the soil, her gloves stained dark as she pressed marigold seedlings into place. The air smelled of wet mulch and lilacs, the rhythmic scrape of her trowel steadying her heartbeat. She had spent months fighting storms inside courtrooms, on porches, and in her own living room. Now, for the first time in what felt like forever, the battlefields had given way to rows of flowers. Behind her, the screen door squeaked open. Emma's voice floated across the yard, light and warm. "Brought you coffee, Grandma." Caroline straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. She accepted the mug, steam curling up into the crisp air, carrying the scent of roasted beans. "Perfect timing," she said, her lips tugging into a faint smile. They sat side by side on the porch steps, sipping in silence. The garden stretched before them, neat rows of color, small sprouts pushing upward, promise rooted in the soil. The world felt smaller here, quieter, and Caroline realized she liked it that way. Later, inside, they spread a stack of envelopes across the dining table. The letters came in cream, pale blue, and plain white, some with neat handwriting, others messy and eager. They were thank you notes from the scholarship recipients, the first wave of students whose futures Carolyn had quietly reshaped. Emma slit one open with care and began to read. Dear Mrs. Hayes, you've given me more than money. You've given me the chance to stay in school and focus on helping others. I promise I won't waste it. She glanced up, her eyes shining. Grandma, this one's going into a frame. Caroline smiled softly, lifting another envelope. Her hands, once tense from gripping binders and legal files, now moved with patience. She read a letter about a first-generation student who no longer had to work nights to pay tuition, another from a young woman studying counseling, who wrote about wanting to guide others through grief. By the third letter, Caroline's throat tightened. She laid the page gently on the table, her voice hushed. This is my family now, the people who needed me. Emma slid from her chair and wrapped her arms around her grandmother, holding her tight. Carolyn leaned into the embrace, her eyes closing briefly. The warmth of Emma's arms was different from obligation. It was choice. It was loyalty freely given. The afternoon sunlight spilled through the dining room windows, catching on the framed photos of Caroline's late husband and the fresh letters Emma had already pinned along the wall. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and lemon polish, the hum of peace filling the house in place of tension. Carolyn sat back, exhaling deeply. The binder still sat on the sideboard, thick with evidence of battles fought. But today, she didn't need to touch it. Today, her legacy wasn't bound in leather and paper, but in the words of grateful strangers, people whose names would carry her efforts forward long after she was gone. The doorbell rang just as Emma began stacking the letters back into a neat pile. The chime echoed too sharp against the calm of the house, and Carolyn's brow furrowed. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. Emma padded to the front door and bent to pick up the envelope lying on the mat. She turned it over, her expression darkening. It's from Dad. Caroline's eyes followed the envelope, her pulse slowing with the weight of recognition. The paper was heavier than ordinary mail, her son's name scrawled across the corner in rushed handwriting. Emma held it out. Do you want to open it? Caroline shook her head slowly, her face calm but resolute. No, some words don't deserve the air they're written on. She took the envelope, dropped it onto the counter, and left it unopened. The paper sat there under the afternoon sun, sharp and silent, a reminder that peace was fragile and always tested. The letter sat on the counter for 2 days, its presence heavy and intrusive, like a shadow in the corner of the room. Caroline never touched it except to move it from the table to the counter, and from the counter to her desk. She didn't need to open it. She already knew what it contained. Venom disguised as pleading. Entitlement dressed up as desperation. On the third morning, with sunlight spilling gold across the kitchen, she decided it had occupied her home long enough. She picked up the envelope, the paper rough under her fingertips, and carried it into the study. The shredder hummed to life as she slid the flap into the slot. The machine caught the paper, teeth grinding, chewing Mark's words into thin ribbons. The sound was sharp, final. She watched until the last strip disappeared, leaving only a bin full of shredded white and ink that would never be. Pieced back together, a faint smell of hot paper lingered in the air, strangely satisfying. Caroline exhaled, her shoulders lighter. Turning, her eyes landed on the wall above her desk. There, framed in oak, hung the scholarship plaque from the college, the Hayes Fund for Financial and Counseling Students. The brass plate gleamed in the morning light, catching her reflection. She smiled, a small, steady curve of lips that carried more peace than triumph. Emma walked in then, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the hardwood. She spotted the shredder, still buzzing in its cooling cycle, and the empty spot on the desk where the envelope had been. Did you finally get rid of it? Caroline nodded, her eyes still on the plaque. Emma crossed the room, grinning. Good. He got nothing, Grandma. Not even your attention, Caroline turned to her, her voice quiet but edged with conviction. Exactly. She opened the sideboard drawer and pulled out the binder one last time. Its leather cover was worn now from months of use, but inside, every page was precise. Bank records balanced, legal documents notarized, scholarship funds secured, will finalized. She flipped through the tabs slowly, each one like a chapter of the battle she had survived. Her fingers lingered over the red circle around Mark's name on the original estate plan, now obsolete. She closed the binder with a firm snap, her breath leaving her in one long, steady exhale. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the weight in her chest ease completely. Emma sat on the arm of the chair, leaning close. You did it. You kept your promise to yourself. Caroline tilted her head back, her gaze catching the soft glow of sunlight spilling across the window pane. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was full of new beginnings, of Emma's laughter, of framed letters from students, of the hum of peace she had built brick by brick. She placed the binder back on the shelf, not out of fear this time, but out of closure. Her fight was over, her legacy was secure, and her son, the man who had buried her with words at the cemetery, had ended with nothing. Caroline sat back in her chair, her lungs expanding with a deep, unshaken breath. Freedom didn't roar. It whispered, subtle and steady, the kind you could finally rest in. Her voice, calm and final, filled the quiet room. After my husband's death, my son said, "Get a job. Don't expect anything from me." So I gave him exactly nothing in my will,